This episode of Where Did the Road Go is brought to you in part by our Patreons. If you want to become a patron, go to wheredidtheroadgo.com. And now our show.
Transmission start. Welcome to Where Did the Road Go? Join us as we wander off the path and explore lost history, consciousness, the paranormal, unexplained mysteries, alternative thought, and much more. We are present on the web at wheredidtheroadgo.com. Now here is your host, Seriah.
Welcome to this edition of Where Did the Road Go? And I am talking tonight with Natalie, who's had a lifetime of odd experiences. And how are you tonight?
I'm very well, Seriah. Thank you.
And we've been trying to do this for a few weeks, but it's always my schedule not quite cooperating. But we're here now, and let's go over some of the weird stuff that's happened to you. Like what's the earliest stuff you remember?
Things started happening. But as a little kid, like as a very small child, I was realizing, I'd said to you earlier, I was kind of sitting down tonight and thinking like, wow, I should really, write some of this down and just look backwards and see what was emerging earlier in life. And, I think when I was a little kid, I remember there being a break between the reality that I was aware of and the reality that like all of the adults and grown-ups were living in.
Mm-hmm.
And I realized that I really didn't have like the language at that time to describe it. So I'm thinking probably these are things I was becoming aware of, shifting like maybe around, 3 or 4, although I'm told I was talking by the time I was 6 months old. So who knows,
Wow.
But, yeah, I know. Right. But it was, I just remember how, I remember being at somebody else's house, and I know it wasn't in the state that I live in, and being close to a bush, and I know it had to have been it was a bush. It was like low and close to the ground, and when you're little, everything seems big, but
yeah.
I remember sticking my hands into this bush, and these two things came out of the bush at me, kind of like I had disturbed their space. The way that you disturb like a bug or, an anthill or something, or a spider's nest, and kind of angrily come up out of the ground at you, only they were coming out of the bush. And I didn't have words for what these things were. And the only thing I could think of, because they slivered, was snakes.
Mm-hmm.
Only I knew at that time that that's not what they were. I just didn't know what else to call them. And I remember being utterly startled and distressed by these things coming out of this bush.
That's understandable.
And so I reacted to them the way anyone would react to being startled by something that was totally natural and normal. I just screamed. And leapt backwards and yelled snake. There's something, or probably just snake, because I remember calling it a snake, and having my parents come, and they were looking at the ground. And I was saying, no, they're in the bush. And, having them kind of be confused by the fact that they were in the bush and not on the ground. And then sort of looking at them and thinking, wow, they're not here. They're not understanding me. Like there's a complete failure to communicate here. But I couldn't describe what I'd seen as anything other than a snake, because it was like a snake, but it wasn't a snake. And there were 2 of them. And they sort of came out at me and then dove straight back into the bush together. Kind of like I had startled them, and they didn't expect to see me either. They sort of were coming out to investigate what was disturbing their space.
Right.
So yeah, and I kept trying to explain to these, really stupid adults, like, no, they're not on the ground. They're not here. they're in the bush, and like trying to show them the area where they were. And I remember them, they were like, well, she's obviously, they talk about you like you're not really there when you're a child.
Yeah.
And saying, well, she's obviously really upset about something, but we, I just don't know what the problem is because, snakes aren't in the bush, but like she won't even go near the area where she's pointing to. So they even like examined the bush and kind of like looked through it, and they're like, honey, snakes don't go in, they don't live up in this area, they're on the ground. And I just remember being completely disappointed. Like they're just never going to get it. They just don't understand. But I really remember like I didn't want to go anywhere near that bush. Much in the same way, like, as a child, I had severe arachnophobia. From as long back, as far back as I can remember. And if I knew there was a spider in a room, I wouldn't want to go near it, near the room. So that bush kind of existed, in a similar space, for me, because I didn't want to go near it after seeing that.
Right. That's really
so
weird.
That was the first. Isn't that weird? I have no idea what it was, but I remember very well what I saw.
Yeah.
Wish I could draw, and I can't. If I were a cartoonist, I'd have a brilliant cartoon for it. But they were very like snake or eel-like, and more. Yeah, it's hard to describe.
Yeah.
They had like whiskers on, kind of like a catfish, but they weren't. It was. I don't really remember the color. I guess I would have been kind of like a gray or kind of a gray green. But it was very startling. I remember being really upset.
I don't think I've ever heard of something like that before. That's why it's so interesting.
Yeah, right. I don't think I've ever heard anyone else talk about something like that either. In that same way. That would be one I'd be very curious to get Josh's take on. Like, is it like if it could be an elemental or, I mean, my impression now as an adult, as I look back on it, is that they were ethereal, probably in nature.
Right.
But I don't know why I would say that. I know they weren't, because I knew what a snake was, and I had seen snakes before, and these were not snakes, but I didn't have another word to describe something that was long, long and slithery legs, and I don't think I even had a word for eels yet at that point. Very bizarre, very, very bizarre. So that was the first one.
That's a great one.
And it only gets more bizarre from there. So that was the first one I remember. The second one was being at at some kind of a park, like for a picnic, and with a group of people, probably from church or something. My parents were really active in the local church, and I don't even remember the name of the park. I can remember the way the park felt, and I remember being there close to dusk, and I know it was summer. And I remember standing at the edge of this pond, staring at the pond, and knowing that there was either some kind of a creature in the pond or behind the pond, or maybe that even was the pond that made and was very, like, the whole sort of area seemed like it was speaking to me somehow.
Right.
It was very bizarre, and I remember trying to explain it to a man, like a very young man that was standing nearby, who was like, cute little thing. I was, again, probably 3 or 4. And trying to kind of engage me. And I kept trying to tell him, like, there's something here, like there's something in something's making a noise. like it was a roar, or I'm not really sure how to describe it. It was so, it's so visceral when you're a child, and you don't, you're not thinking about words, you're just experiencing
Yeah.
and being. But it was very it felt like a roar or a rumble, and it wasn't it wasn't friendly. It wasn't hostile, but it certainly wasn't friendly. Like, it wasn't happy that we were there. And I really, in retrospect, I don't think it was a thing necessarily. It wasn't like, it wasn't it wasn't a hidden Sasquatch or something. I mean, I guess that's always possible, but
Right.
it wasn't that. It was like, it was the pond itself, or the area around the pond itself, that had its own thing going on, like its own consciousness. And it was grumbly and unhappy. And I remember it was just green. It was covered, everything was covered in algae. Um, it was very unsettling. It was most unsettling. And I remember trying to explain that to this person with very few words for it. And he had no idea what I was talking about, as adults so frequently don't with small children. They start kind of babbling about something that's clearly happening in their awareness that
Mm-hmm.
we aren't related to. And I think I started to kind of do that. And the guy was just kind of thought, well, I guess we'll just make this a game, and
Mm.
kind of made it into a game, and got very playful and silly with me. And I just couldn't quite get into it. I just was like, yeah, he just doesn't get it. I don't know what to do with this.
Right.
But I remember, I think that was about the point at which I started to recognize, like, reality, there's a big split between my reality and the reality that everyone else is having.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to have to figure this out somehow, because there's a disconnect. Like, it was almost an active thought process at around that age that I started to go, yeah, something's really off. I'm going to have to make a shift.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And how old were you, do
So
you think?
I'm guessing, somewhere around 3 or 4.
Okay.
Little, little.
Yeah, yeah.
So, yeah. And I've had those experiences as an adult with toddlers and small children, where I can tell, like, watching them, they're somewhere else. They're not 100% sharing the same reality that I am,
Right.
in a particular moment. They may not be able to describe it. And I guess in retrospect, because of that, I do my best not to dismiss it. And if what they're needing is, like, comfort, okay, like, find a way to comfort them. And if they're not wanting comfort, and instead what they really are just wanting is, to explain something, to do my best to let them do that, and not fight too hard to understand it.
Yeah.
Because in doing that, you're kind of dismissing their reality
Mm-hmm.
a little bit.
And I think that's what happens
Uh,
as we grow older. We learn what the accepted reality is, and we block out all the other stuff.
right, right. And that is, that's at the root of a lot of what, where I kind of, or how I see things, I guess, is recognizing that at some point there was that split. And yeah, I think again, as you get older, you learn a lot of things in the meantime. And um start to put them back together in different ways, or to just forget about trying to put them together, because you may not, in putting them together, you could be missing significant portions of the puzzle. We're just
Yeah,
learning to let them be as they are.
that is very
um,
true. We try to categorize everything so narrowly.
yeah, yeah. And it's not always helpful.
No, no. It may
We
make you
like,
feel better.
right, right. In the short term, it will. Absolutely. You can put that one to bed. You've solved it. It's perfect. We got it now. Until it comes creeping back up on you again, and in a completely different form, and you're at a loss, right? You can't put it in the same box again.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. So yeah, so those are the first two, and then I think as I got older, I know those preceded the next sort of significant thing that I remember happening, which I know for a fact happened when I was 5. Um, and I know feel like those were a lot earlier. Um, so when I was 5, I was out riding my big wheel. Um, those were great. I was riding my big wheel up and down like the streets, in the neighborhood right out front of my house, and I could hear the phone ringing inside my house, and I would have said it was like early evening, um, and I heard some crying inside, or some loud voices inside the house. And I just remember as I was pedaling along, I just stopped and thought to myself, oh, okay, he died.
Mm.
And I just kept riding my big wheel. And a few minutes later, I remember my dad coming out of the front door of the house. And I thought, okay, yeah, I've got to pull it together and look like this is a problem, because it was clearly a problem.
Right.
And, I left my big wheel, on the curb, and went over to my dad. And, I remember he sat on the hood of the car that we had at that time, and said, Natalie, can you come over here? I just need to talk to you for a few minutes and tell you about something. And so I went over to talk to him, and I remember his face was really red, and he just kept wiping at his face. And I thought, oh, he's crying. And he just couldn't seem to speak. And I said, finally, Daddy, it's okay. I understand. Grandpa died, didn't he?
Hmm.
And I just remember him being utterly shocked and kind of looking at me. He said, well, yes, he did. That's right. Yes, he did die. He just passed away. We just got the phone call. And I said, yeah. And it was not a like, to me, it was not a problem.
Right.
And it's not that I didn't love my grandfather. It just that he died was not a problem. But I could see that my dad was upset, and something in me knew, like, don't be insensitive, or don't be a jerk. And I just remember kind of looking at him, and I said, "Are you okay, Dad?" And he said, "Yeah, I'll be okay, sweetheart. I'm really sad. I'm really upset." And I gave him a big hug, and I said, "Okay, can I ride my big wheel now?"
Hmm.
And I just remember he was like, "Well, yeah, yeah, you can ride your big wheel, you can." And I just went back and rode my big wheel. I never cried. Um, I remember seeing him in the coffin, which we politely refer to as a casket in American culture,
Right.
but it's a coffin. I remember seeing him in there. And I remember just looking at him and thinking, that's him, just like, okay. Um, but it I don't know how I knew, and it wasn't like someone told me, or like, um, that he died, or anything. It was just something I knew.
Right.
Yeah.
The information was just there.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's not an uncommon experience for me either. That something is just, it seems like obvious information to me, and I'll find that I'll be startled into realizing, wait, I don't think this person actually told me this highly sensitive, extremely personal information, did they? And kind of having to pause before opening my mouth,
Mm-hmm.
and kind of, but not being sure where I got it. Did I
Yeah.
read that? Did I, where did that come from? And often, like, it happened once, with us, not that long ago, like maybe 2 years ago, with a student, and I knew, I'd been teaching a class where we were talking a lot about the brain and trauma and how those play out in the body and in the limbic system. And, this young woman wanted to come and talk to me, and I knew instantly that she wanted, because it happens a lot anyway, but that she'd wanted to come and tell me something really traumatic that had happened to her. And it's always my preference to handle situations like that with as much sensitivity and care and presence as I can.
Oh, sure.
Yeah. And but yet I was, I had another class in 10 minutes or something, and kind of just needed her to get to the point. I knew that she was going to tell me that she had experienced a really traumatic rape, and it almost came flying out of my mouth because I was crushed for time and having, 3 or 4 other students wanting to talk and being aware of trying to protect the space. And thankfully I was able to just shut my mouth and stop, and kind of go, whoa, this is not information that she's actually told you. You need to just be quiet for a second here. Let it come out of her mouth first.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's the most recent episode of something like that happening that I can remember, where it was really like, whoa, hit the brakes.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a conflict. Those are the ones that I tend to be most aware of, is like the ones where there's a lot of conflict around it for some reason. Yeah. But yeah, so that was kind of like up to the age of 5. And somewhere around when I was about 7, we moved house. And, I would also say, or throw in there, I was what they would refer to, what anyone would probably refer to as a highly imaginative child.
Mm-hmm.
And I will admit, freely, as an artist, and especially as someone trained in theater, like, you're kind of get it hardwired into your system, in an extra kind of way, to be incredibly suggestible.
Yeah.
So I'm always really aware of, like, okay, well, could it be this? Could it be this? I'm a very suggestible person, so maybe I could be experiencing all of these kinds of things. But I also know that I'm very objective and highly rational. So, I do kind of, I've stopped dismissing a lot of the things that happened to me as I was growing up, as much as I might have, because in retrospect, I've started to go, wait a minute, that's not a normal, I don't hear people telling stories like that. That's not normally what other kids are kind of talking about or thinking about, or whatever. So
Yeah.
I've kind of several years ago started to kind of re-examine some of that, as a result. But I do remember probably around the age of 9 or 10, or maybe as young as 8. It could have been as young as 8. My sister and I used to stay up really late at night on a Saturday night, like really late, as in like 10:30 or 11, because as a kid, that's really late.
Sure.
So, it was a big treat. My parents had just built this enormous house, that we'd moved into in the woods, which is where I live now. And we enjoyed, sleeping in this room that at that time was kind of the guest room, but was intended to become, and I'm doing my little air quotes, the study. But it at that time, it just had our like pull out sofa and a television, which as little kids is like, whoopee, this is
Right.
great. So my sister and I would have, like a Saturday night sleepover in the study where we could watch, whatever the comedy TV show lineup was, and fall asleep watching Saturday Night Live or something. And on a particular night, I remember, we had done that, and I woke up for whatever reason, like in the middle of the night, like I was jolted awake. And as I sat up in bed, um, I was aware that there was a grown-up in the room, and so I turned over towards like where the closet was, so that would have been like to my left. Um, and right at the foot of the bed, there was a window, and I remember there was a lot of moonlight, and the moonlight was creating like a shaft of light across the bed. Um, and this woman was standing against the closet doors, and like the light was going across her from like around the shoulders and collarbone, you know, on down. But her head was in shadow, and like from like the top of her legs on down was also in shadow because of that. And she was wearing like a big oversized football jersey, and for whatever reason, I feel like the numbers were 89. I've always thought that. I don't know why. Probably because it said 89. Who knows?
Yeah.
um, it was like 89 or 84 or something. And I at the time, I really thought it was my Aunt Sydney, and who was alive, you know? And so I remember I kind of let out a gasp, like, hey, and I was about to say, like, hey, I didn't know you were here. Because when we were kids, if we stayed over at her house, it would not be an uncommon thing to wake up in the night and she'd be standing in the room, like checking on us or something. You know, as you're a kid, people are always coming in the room checking on you for things. You know,
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, especially if you got two little kids together, you want to make sure they're not up to something, and you know, so you go in and check.
Yeah.
So you know, as a kid, you're just used to seeing that, and I remember I just thought, oh, that's who that is, and as I let out the gasp, one of her arms went towards where her mouth would be with like one finger, as in like shh, you know, don't make any sound, and then pointed to my sister, and then the arm went back down, and I thought, okay, I guess. All right, well, I wasn't being that disruptive. Fine, whatever, you know, and kind of rolled over and went back to sleep and didn't think anything of it. Got up the next morning, went in and said, "So where's Aunt Sydney?" And I remember my parents were like, "What?" And I said, "Well, she was did Jim and Sydney come over last night?" And you know, they hadn't. They had not been there.
Yeah.
No idea who that person was.
Well, maybe it was her in an out of body state.
It could have been. Yeah, I mean, it could have been. I wish I could have seen the woman's face. You know, it was definitely a woman, a very skinny woman, but you know, I really don't, you know, I don't know anything else about who it was. It was just a very similar like behavior. And it very well could have been her. Um, I guess that's always possible.
Yeah.
It's
As much as
the
anything
property
else.
as much as anything else. Absolutely. I'd never thought of that until just now. That's really wow. This is why this is awesome. It's good food for thought. Um, so yeah, that was a weird one. That was a weird one. Um, there's a lot of weird stuff that goes on this property. Because I told you about the light stuff.
Yeah. You want to talk a little more about that?
Sure. Um, I mean, I felt like right from when we moved to this property, I remember feeling like, again, kind of like that pond. um, like the property itself was kind of alive
Mm-hmm.
somehow. Um, and, you know, all of the stuff that they talk about, you know, I've heard on paranormal TV shows and stuff about groundwater, like having like like a water table under your property, or lots of quartz or limestone, or you know, all of these different. I'm like, well, yeah, we can tick the box on all of those.
Mm.
Or you know, there's running water on the property. There's a creek and a spring. And we do, you know, we have found we have found like artifacts of like you know, arrowheads and um you know, tools and things, you know, around the creek and the creek bed and so on. So we know that, you know, at some point it was inhabited by someone else,
Mm-hmm.
even though we're the first ones that we know of to build here. Um, But at any rate, like the light thing, the first one that happened, and there've really only been two. I was probably about 12 or 13, and we had a pickup truck, and we used to go out in the pickup truck with like some straw bales in the back and like pick up a lot of other neighborhood kids that were our friends. And my dad would drive us around from one place to the next around the neighborhood, and we'd go trick or treating. And on this particular occasion, we were driving back home, and we dropped everybody off. And my sister, my dad, and I were in the cab of the truck. And I remember I was looking out the window and saw kind of like the same color, maybe like as a glow stick, but kind of more green than that even. Color, like a ball out in the woods. And it was like, it wasn't very high. It was like it wasn't on the ground. It was just above the ground. And it was probably about the size of maybe a basketball or a soccer ball. And it wasn't moving. It was just there. And it was really weird because your mind immediately thinks like, well, it's Halloween. I guess somebody put a thing in the woods, But at that time, there were no houses built on that part of that property. There was nothing there. And it was far enough back away from the road that it wouldn't have been convenient for someone to get back there at night. It was just really bizarre. And I remember we stopped the truck and my dad was kind of looking out there, and I said, "What is that?" And, he said, I really don't know. I don't know what that is. I guess it could be anything. I just don't know. I don't know what that is. And we kind of looked at it for a few more seconds and drove on. And that was it. It never moved. It never did anything. And I've never seen it again.
All right. Have you seen any other types of lights on your property?
The other one I saw was the one I mentioned about that happened, I think, earlier this year in January. It was like right around, it would have been late. I'm pretty sure it was January. I was going to say it could have been late December, but I feel like it was January. And we had a terrible, like, freezing spell out here. And I was in my mom and dad's house. I should also explain, like, I have my own house on this property, on the same property.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very, very small and very minimal. And I had gone from being up in my mom and dad's house, which is the big house, to being down here where I am in mine. And I'd been listening to podcasts. I do a lot of that. I have my headphones on while I'm doing stuff and, doing laundry or cooking or cleaning things. And I'd been listening to someone talking about UFOs and what they are or aren't, which I always find a completely engaging, dialogue, because it's all in the details.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's all in the details, which are so fascinating. But and in this one they were talking about light, and it may have been. I don't think it was one of your podcasts. I think I'd remember if it were, but they were talking about lights and like balls of light and how, when did UFOs go from being, machines to being something that's just like a ball of light that just kind of streaks across the sky. And, it was that kind of a debate. And
Right.
I remembered thinking, like, I really wish I could see something like that. And then kind of having to pause and go, have I seen a UFO? And I say that because, like, as a kid, I was obsessed with UFOs. And wanting so badly to see one. And, I'm terribly nearsighted. And I had a bed with a window right next to it. And I remember I'd look out at night, and every airplane that went by, it was like, oh my gosh, this could be the one.
Nice.
This could be it, and of course it never was. And for a while, my dad would be like, well, if you ever see one, come and get me, because I want to see it too. And after about 3 or 4 of those where I'd go and get him, and he'd be like, yep, that's a plane. You don't have to explain. You can tell because, if you look closely, and I'd be like, Dad, I can't tell. I don't have my glasses. And he'd be like, well, put your glasses on next time, for crying out loud. It's 2 a.m, like it's not what I want to be woken up over. Um, but, so I've seen a lot of stuff in the sky before that I kind of have questioned, where I've kind of thought, could that be unexplained? I don't know. I don't know whether it is or not. And of course, you usually end up dismissing it.
Right.
Because you can't put it in a box, and it wasn't super significant or life changing. And so it goes in the kind of like, oh, well, and you don't think about it. So I kind of was thinking to myself, have I seen something like that? I feel like I probably have. Gosh, when am I look at the sky enough. When do I get to see a freaking UFO? It would be really nice. And it was kind of late, at night. I think I wrote it down at the time, and I don't have my notes from that right now. I want to say it was like 11 o'clock at night, or, it was later, late-ish, late for me. And I was walking towards my house with my dog and my flashlight and whatever. And it was a really clear night, and it was really, really cold, like single digits cold. And I remember I just looked up for a split second, and I saw this light almost kind of just pop up. And it's like the instant I saw it and looked at it, it streaked off. It just went away. Um, and I just laughed. I mean, I didn't know what else to do. I just thought, well, that's really funny, like, that's hysterical. That's hilarious. Why would
Yeah.
that, like,
But that's
why?
how it works.
Yeah, yeah. And yeah, it totally does. It totally does. And I didn't, other than just kind of I really let out like a full bellied laugh, like, I'm clearly capable of, right in the middle of the woods, and just wandered on into my house and thought, well, that's one to write down, that's a good one. Thanks for that. That was entertaining, like,
Yeah.
because what else are you
Yeah.
gonna do? What else are you gonna do? It was just there and it was gone.
Yeah. And that's how I feel about a lot of stuff. It's just kind of like, okay, well, that was interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't scare me. I've only really had like one experience that really freaked me out. And in retrospect, I find that really interesting. I wish I could revisit that moment to really see like what was the dynamic that made me freak out. But again, it was on this property. Interestingly, again, it was Halloween. And I know this is kind of, it sounds stereotypical. I really do feel like something shifts when the light shifts and it starts to become autumn. Something shifts,
Yeah.
and it
Right.
feels, it's palpable.
Uh huh.
You know, the atmosphere is different. The way that the light is different. Everything's just a little bit different. But it happened again. Like, this was on actual, like, the day of Halloween. I think I was about 21. I must have been. Um, yeah, I was 21, and I was gonna go. I just graduated from college, and I was gonna go to a party that was in the city. And I don't live in the city. Obviously, I live out in the woods. But I was going to go back into the city for a party at my friend's house, and I'd come home from my day job, and was going to go in the house and get dressed and dolled up to go out. And something in the house felt off, like the whole house wasn't right. And I always felt like that the house could have that feeling from time to time when I was a younger person.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I wouldn't, my parents were always like, that's ridiculous. It's a brand new house. We just built it.
Right.
There's nothing funny about the house. Just get it out of there was a lot of like gentle it was relatively gentle dismissal of like, she's a little bit, she's imaginative, she's got her imagination. But it would just feel off. And this was one of those nights it just felt weird. And I remember I walked into the house and my parents were already gone, at someone else, at someone else's house. And it was just the dog that was home. And the dog was already poorly behaved, but he was never aggressive or mean. And suddenly he sort of just kind of got around me and became really aggressive and mean. And it really freaked me out. And I remember I put him in his crate. He's only a tiny dog. It was a Shih Tzu. It wasn't a big threatening dog.
Right.
But it freaked me out because it wasn't his normal behavior. And I think he bit me. I tried to take something away from him that he'd stolen, and he bit me. It was just out of character, and that had me really freaked out. And so I remember calling my mom and saying, like, something is wrong with Fezziwig. He's not himself. I don't know what's wrong with him. The house feels weird. I feel weird. Everything's weird. And having her kind of be like, well, it's okay. Just take a few breaths and everything will be fine. And just go over to your friend's house and have your party and whatever. We got off the phone. And we have like a garage that is attached to the house by like a little pass through, like a little added on hallway kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And I went to go into the garage through this little pass through. And it was like the minute I opened the door to go out there, like the whole atmosphere changed. And as I went walking out into the garage, trying to explain like the structure. So the garage was, you'd go through this little hallway, which is very small, and then the whole garage would open up sort of to your right. And to my immediate right, as I, crossed from this passageway into the rest of the garage, out of the peripheral vision, to my right was this creature. This thing, and it was very foggy. Like the form itself was very foggy. It was probably 20-25 feet away from me, like just outside the garage itself, but like standing right in the door of the garage. And if I had to describe it, I don't know. It was probably about 4 feet tall, and it was all gray, like dark gray, black looking. And I just got a general overall sense of the way it looked. It wasn't super clear at all. And in fact, when I turned to look at it directly, like it lost contrast, like instead of being as dark as it was, it became a lot lighter.
Like it faded?
Yeah, like it faded. So I remember I kind of turned my head back a little bit so I could still be seeing it out of my peripheral vision, which seemed like it was clearer. And it was kind of, it had like, it was like a fried, this is the weirdest thing. It was like a fried gargoyle or it was very gargoyle-like. And it was like, it was smoky. I guess that's really, it's not so much that it was fried. It was just very smoky in feel. And it felt terrible. Like the feeling of its presence there felt horrible. And it felt like I could hear it breathe even. Like it had a raspy quality to the way it was breathing. And I remembered at that moment, like I've always been into things that were paranormal or creepy or whatever. So this was nothing new to read about it. But
right.
I remember my response to it was like to remember, okay, I'm supposed to not feel afraid of this because the fear itself might be feeding it.
Right.
And it was like I could flip it off like a switch and thought, oh, wow, that's better. And even in my peripheral vision, I remember it dimmed. It got dimmer.
Hmm.
And I should say at the time, that was half a lifetime ago for me. I'm 42 now. And I'm a very, very different person. But at that time, I was a very devout Christian at that time. And a great believer. And, I, of course, immediately invoked the name of Christ and
Mm-hmm.
told it to get away. And it dimmed a little further. And I thought, okay, I have to walk to my car, which means I'm going to have to turn my back to it. And I'm going to go ahead and do that because that is the best way to show it that it doesn't have one over on me.
Right.
So that's what I did. And I drove away. And I remember it was still kind of just there, but only barely as I drove out.
Hmm.
And thankfully I didn't have to drive past it. I could just, like out and away from it. But, what the funny part to me at that time was that I didn't believe until that moment that anything evil existed. I really was I was very, I was really into the love and light, and I had taken all kinds of classes to become a Reiki master. And, I was really convinced, in my own way that, I wasn't really sure that anything, demonic really could exist.
Hmm. Okay.
I would say even now, I'm not really sure
Yeah.
anything demonic really exists. At this point I don't know what I saw. I really do. I can tell you what I think I was seeing. I can tell you kind of what remember feeling like when I saw it
Mm-hmm.
and the events that happened. But I think for years I categorized it as a demon. And then several years ago, probably around the time I was meditating or had become a Buddhist, which is a major shift. But I really stopped thinking that it was necessarily a demon and started just wondering if it was something else,
Right.
you know?
And that's good to get out of that type of mindset.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know what it was.
That's the best mindset to have.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, that's it. That's my whole practice right there in a nutshell. Is, Korean Zen is to ask yourself regularly, what is it? Don't know. Don't know. I have no idea. Could be anything. But yeah, those were kind of some little weird experiences there.
Okay. All right. And does that kind of cover your major weirdness?
I mean, I could be here for a couple of hours telling you about weirdness if you want, Seriah, because there's a lot.
Sure, sure. But those are the things that stick out to you the most.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, those like in my early life. Yeah.
Hmm.
I mean, I could tell you. I'm just flipping through my notes. I could tell you about wow. There's a couple of things. I did have a weird experience last week.
Oh, okay.
That was kind of interesting. Um, it was kind of UFO-y a little bit.
All
I
right.
I saw a thing in the sky and it was there and then it wasn't there. I was driving. It was in the morning, like it was last Wednesday morning, the 13th of June, and about 9. I remember I checked the time because I thought, check the time for crying out loud. It was 9:40 a.m. And I was driving northbound on Interstate 270 just outside of St. Louis. And there's an airport nearby, just to the east of there. Lambert International Airport is there. And, I was kind of in a kind of easy, relaxed state driving along. And I sort of looked up to my left, which would have been slightly northwest, and there was a plane, I thought. But when because it was sort of to the west, when sunlight hits an airplane and it just kind of looks metallic and saucer-like, a little bit lenticular. That's what I was seeing.
Mm-hmm.
And I really thought, like, oh, that's obviously an airplane. And so I started to kind of squint at it a little bit to see if I could make out, the shape of a wing or something, or tail. And it reminded me of a dream that I'd had the night before. And that dream kind of came back very vividly and very suddenly. And the dream was like I was sitting in a restaurant, and I looked out the window of the restaurant and thought I was seeing a couple of flying saucers going past.
Mm.
And as I grabbed my companions at the table to say, look, 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 there's some flying saucers, as we all turned to look, they turned into something attached to a tugboat. They weren't actually flying saucers. Like, they cleared a space, or some buildings and things that were covering the tugboat part. And as they cleared that space, it was obvious that they were attached to the tugboat. They weren't flying saucers at all. And I remembered thinking, wow, look at that. Isn't that funny how the mind does that? Gosh, that's so weird. So that dream popped back to me at that moment. And that's when I started to look for the wing or the tail. And as I did and started to look, a bank of trees came by and obscured the view of this plane for a minute. Or not even a minute, probably 2 or 3 seconds. And as soon as I passed the bank of trees, there was no airplane.
Huh.
Or lenticular shaped metallic object in the sky. And I looked and I looked and I looked and I looked to the extent that I nearly, it was a little, I wasn't ever reckless. It was close a moment or two, but it was really baffling, because then what happened to it? Airplanes don't.
Yeah.
Like, airplanes don't do that. They don't just, like, they're not there 1 second and not, they're not there 1 second and then not there the next. That's not how they go.
Yeah.
It's way too much wide open, space for it not to be visible in some direction or another, even accounting for, like, curving of the road. Or it was really, it was that one that got me. That was like, okay, pay attention. Those things happen. You want to note it down, because it also was interesting to me that it connected so much with that dream.
Yeah. No, that's really interesting.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much for sharing some of these experiences. These are really unique, and that's I love talking to people about stuff like that.
Yeah. I mean, we didn't even get into the Kundalini related stuff or mediumship stuff or.
Well, let's talk Kundalini. I can't let you go once you mention Kundalini.
Oh, well, there we go. Yeah. It's that's some intense stuff, man.
What are your experiences with it?
Oh, I mean, I was diagnosed with fibromyalgia.
Okay.
Back in 2010. And I know, like, because of there were a lot of consciousness related shifts that were really heavy and hard and fast that were happening right around that same time. And they were also coincident with a lot of other, like, traumatic things that were happening in my life as well. And I think at the time it didn't make sense to me that what it was Kundalini. But interestingly, like, I suddenly remember being able to go to yoga class, for example, and poses I could never do before or didn't quite get suddenly just almost did themselves. Which I know sounds very, it's a very stereotypical, like, oh, well, it must be related to yoga or whatever. But I'd been practicing, yoga for about 10 years at that point. and I'd been meditating hardcore for about 2 years. But I mean, I think I probably was having experiences with it before that, but I do notice, like, if it's happening a lot in my body, it will throw my joints off.
Mm-hmm.
Do you ever get that?
I don't, but it is common.
Okay. Yeah, I'll notice, like, my sacroiliac joints will kind of get thrown off kilter by it. And like, even talking about it now, my whole body goes really hot.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
Mm-hmm.
suddenly every part of my body is feels hot and very inflamed, because if I talk about energy, suddenly that will happen.
Right. Right. Now, were you practicing Kundalini yoga?
No,
Oh, okay.
just no more, just yoga.
Hmm.
Um, a lot of pranayama, like a lot of breath work,
Right.
um, but not a lot of not any kriyas. Like, it wasn't any kind of like kriya yoga or kundalini yoga specifically. Um,
Okay.
but like, in the last, I was directing a show, like, in March, and so I bought a watch because I thought I really need to have a watch, because I don't want to just have my cell phone there. I kind of, I have a love-hate relationship with technology, and I really didn't want the burden of, like, someone sent you a text message and here's 32 emails, and
Yeah.
I just wanted to be able to kind of just be there, but I needed to keep an eye on the time. And so I bought a watch, and I don't think I wore that for more than a week before it started to just kind of slow down or stop.
Yep.
Um,
Yep.
yeah. And I thought, oh man, it's brand new. It already needs a new battery. And so I was about ready to get the battery checked, but I'd taken it off and put it in my handbag, and
Mm-hmm.
thought, I'll deal with that later. Well, I pulled it out a few days later, and it was running fine. It started back up again fine. So I thought, okay, I wound it to the right time, put it on, and it, similar thing. Within a day or so, it was stopped. And I eventually started to realize, like, oh, I haven't tried to wear a watch for years, and I didn't think about it, but probably I can't wear watches anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah, you
Huh.
know, and I definitely seem to have an effect on, like, electrical things,
Yep.
which, I have.
It's very common.
Yeah, very common.
And even just having the weird experiences you've had, that's
Yeah.
common now.
Yeah, just, and I love it when you guys have roundtables where you get into talking about what is the other, or what
Mm-hmm.
the other may be. Um, because that's what I want, I wonder, like, when I look at the earlier experiences that I had as a little kid, and this, when I think about, like, the one, that experience in January, or the one last week, where there's something there and then it's not there, and it seems almost in direct response to something in your own consciousness.
Right.
What is that?
Yeah.
Well, could it be the same thing as the little guys coming out of the bush, or the pond that has it, that is its own consciousness? Is that part of it? I don't know, but I kind of feel like it has to be. I don't know. I think really, the three-dimensional reality that we've all set for ourselves here is not. It's the tip of the iceberg.
Yes. Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, it's
It's
humbling.
it, it's a small fraction of our actual reality.
Yeah, yeah. Like, I don't. I feel like we get. I feel like I get, like, little glimpses here and there. Um, but I know, I always feel like I'm being witnessed by something. There's kind of an omnipresent other presence that's always around, that's more than one, but is unnameable in every possible way, but is just always there,
Yeah. Yeah.
and responsive on some level. And I can't begin to even know what that is, or how to describe that. You know.
What now what about your mediumship?
Well, I have questions about whether mediumship is real, and yet I know that I've experienced some things. I mean, I had enough experiences, or what I thought were experiences of like seeing, not so much seeing visibly with the eye, but like, hearing a person that's deceased, or being very aware of being able to almost have a conversation with someone in my head. Here's a good one. I forgot about this one. It's on my list, but I've been all over the place here. But I had an experience in this house up here one time where trying to figure out a way to kind of make this not the longest story ever. Basically, basically, I was living in London. I lived there for 10 years in my 20s and early 30s, and I'd come home. I'm thinking it was sometime around 2004 or 5. I'd come home for a visit, and I want to say it wasn't Christmas. It would have had to have been around in the summer, and I remember when I got home, maybe the first or second morning I was home, my dad and I were in the kitchen, and my dad was saying like, "Hey, I think, I can hear your sister up in the bathroom getting up and, running the water. So I think I'll go ahead and make breakfast." So he went ahead and started breakfast, and then, she didn't come down. So eventually, we went to look for him, "Hey, I got pancakes down here." And she was still sound asleep. She'd never gotten up. And so he came back down and said, "Your sister she's not at a bed. That's so weird." And, he asked her when she finally came down, she said, "Oh, I thought that was Natalie in the bathroom." And I said, "Oh, I wasn't in the bathroom. I was down here." And while we were sitting down there, we thought we could hear the toilet flush and, maybe the shower running. We could hear the plumbing on at any rate. And so my dad got up and went and checked it. And he said, I got to be honest, girls, I've heard this a couple of times this week, and thought, well, what's going on up there? And I'd go up there and find that something was going on with the toilet. Like it was running all the time, and he'd fix it or readjust it, and it would be fine for a day or two. And then the problem would come back, but only after hearing it flush a time or two. So we all kind of shrugged it off and didn't think much about it. And a couple of nights later, we were sitting around in the evening watching television and heard this really loud boom, like someone, like a tree had fallen on the house. And in fact, my dad was so concerned that maybe one had, that he got out a flashlight and went outside to double check. I mean, it really startled us all terribly. It was like someone took, a huge chest of drawers and just dropped it from a great height. And, a second one happened maybe 30 minutes later, loud bang or a boom, and it shook the house. And again, we didn't find anything. Well, this went on, at intervals throughout the night, but it lessened in intensity all night. And maybe 2 or 3 days later, I mean, we'd forgotten about it by then, kind of. 2 or 3 days later, I remember early in the morning, I was kind of halfway awake, and I remember there being a guy in my mind's eye. There was a guy standing in the doorway of the bathroom, and I could see the way he was dressed. He had like sandy blonde hair that was really shaggy, like it had once been cut, in a short haircut, but had grown out, and a beard. And he had a lot of blood on his head, like crusted into his hair and on his face, and some like little cuts and some bruising. He had on like a flannel shirt. I remember the way and he was not the flannel man, but
Right.
but he had on a flannel shirt, and jeans. He'd been through something. And I just in my mind said to him, well, hey, what's going on? And he said, well, what are you doing here? And we had this little conversation back and forth. He didn't know who I was. and he wondered like what I was doing in the house as well. And I said, well, what do you mean? And the way he described it to me was that he said his name was Lyle, and he said that he'd been walking along the service road and got hit by a car. And so he'd gotten up and dusted himself off and walked through the woods because he'd seen the light on at a house and nobody was home. So he just let himself in. And he said, I'm just trying to get cleaned up and pulled together so I can move on.
Hmm.
And I said, oh, have you been using the shower? And he said, yeah, I keep trying to wash the blood off. It's not coming off. And I realized, like, as I was having this little, like, early morning, just, really like half dreamlike conversation with this imaginary friend, like this is really not normal. I don't know that I could make this up. And I remember kind of thinking that, and then kind of thinking, oh, I'm not sure that he's okay. This guy might be kind of stuck. And I said, well, there's a lot of other people living here. And it was clear he couldn't see anybody else. Like he wasn't aware of my sister or my dad or my mom. And he said, well, I said, well, if anybody comes around and they come looking for you specifically, you should really go. You should go with them. And he was like, okay, well, he was very nonplussed about it and like, okay, whatever. It never happened again. We never had the plumbing go funny again after that. Like a lot of the weird little things that were happening around that time period kind of stopped. And I told my dad about it, and he was so taken in by it because I got up and was like, did I make that up?
Mm-hmm.
Did that happen? Did I really think? So I told my dad. He noted down the details and he went and looked it up and did some research. And he started by going to the police station to say, did anybody get hit? He knew right around the location. They said they couldn't tell him anything. So he went to the librarian at the local community college where he was teaching and said, hey, could you look something up for me? I'm looking to find this out. And it turned out that there was a guy who was a homeless guy which made sense based on what I was seeing. And he called himself Lyle or Larry, depending on who he was talking to. And he had turned up as a John Doe in locally and had been killed in a car accident just off the service road.
Hmm.
So that really shook me. I like that.
I bet.
That change. That was a game changer. That's when I stopped thinking maybe I was making it up. Although I
Right.
still sometimes am worried that I might be.
Sure. Well, sure. Absolutely. This stuff is so ephemeral. It's so barely there sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah. It really is. And it's not you can't put your finger on it all the time. But
No.
it has become clear to me like there are times when someone is clearly there and maybe just for a few seconds or 30 seconds and it's very clear who they are. I may hear their voice for a second. That's happened a lot at people's funerals.
Hmm.
The person that's dead, whose funeral it is will just unmistakable comment, like right in my ear,
Yeah.
that it is definitely them, but really hard to pin down, aside from just the one comment or the one, little moment or incident. And when they're not, I've noticed very strongly that like when they're not there anymore, they're just not. Like your mind isn't even on them anymore. They're just not
Yeah.
there, you know. But when I was in London, I did spend some time training with the Spiritualist Association at Belgrave Square. And I saw a lot of really, really nefarious stuff. In all honesty, enough that they were good people, they were kind people, and I don't want to disparage anyone, but it bothered me sometimes that I would realize like nothing's coming through, nothing's happening, I don't get anything. I'm getting freaked out because people are staring at me, and I'm in theater and I don't have any lines that I'm supposed to give, and I don't want to be fake. And
Yeah.
I gotta say it, like, I'll just hands up, nothing's happening today. Sorry, folks, no show. Gotta sit down. Someone else's turn. And I remember that was like really discouraged. It was like, no, come back. And I started to realize there were times, a lot of people will come back over and over and over again. They're addicted to that theoretical contact with a loved one through this medium. And if the medium knows that, it's very, very alluring when nothing's coming through to just remember, oh, that's right, so and so's here and they have a this or that. I'll just see if I can connect with them. And you know I remember a teacher explaining it to me once as like, well, you're just trying to get the connection going. You're just trying to just by talking about it and making a connection with one person, you can kind of get the energy up and get the ball rolling. But I found that so disturbing. I just couldn't get right with it. And I quit after a while completely.
All right.
Except that it's still, the incidents happen from time to time.
Sure. As you would expect.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you. I mean, we've been talking for about an hour, so thank you so much for sharing these.
It's a pleasure, Seriah. It's an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on. I really, really appreciate it.
Absolutely. If anything new and interesting happens, let me know.
I definitely will.
And a special thanks to all of my Patreons, and particularly those pledging $10 or more for the extra support: Super Inframan, Andy McNamara, William Lovelace, Mark Brady, Allison Cook, Craig Cisneros, Donna Beveridge, Sasha Lorg, Christopher Vaughn, Robert Groom, Scott Morris Everett, Chris Elmquist, Russell Wilcoxon, Patricia Giaquinta, Matthias Sumby, and John Eddy. Thank you all so much. You have been listening to Where Did the Road Go? This show is made possible in part from our Patreons, and we thank you and everyone listening for helping us continue this exploration of the strange. You can always find everything Where Did the Road Go related at www.wheredidtheroadgo.com. And thank you so much for your support.